Soren Kierkegaard is one of the most well-established philosophers in history. Known as the father of existentialism and as one of the most important Christians of the modern era. But whether one is religious or not, Kierkegaard's ideas do not lose their value as with many theologians of the past. His ideas have strongly influenced some of the most profound minds in philosophy and psychology, such as Camus and Sartre. Today, I'm going to present the main points of the first part of one of his best-known books, The Sickness Unto Death, written in 1849. In this book, Kierkegaard gives us a thorough analysis of the nature of despair, as well as how it is linked with his religious and philosophical beliefs. It is an extremely dense book to read, for there is no sentence of the text that isn't crucial to the core meaning of the message. This means that one should read it with extreme focus if he wants to truly understand it. But without further ado, let's examine some of the book's ideas. In the very beginning, Kierkegaard writes his definition of what one's self is. Quote, "The self is a relation which relates to itself, or that in the relation which is its relating to itself." At first glance, this definition may seem confusing and vague, but one can make sense of it only by understanding Kierkegaard's idea of what a human being is. Quote, "A human being is a synthesis between the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal, the body and the soul. In short, a synthesis." This concept is further illustrated throughout the book, but the gist of it is that man consists of two forms of being in every sense of being, that which is physical and that which is transcendent. And the self can be described as something like the spirit that holds all the syntheses together. Now despair, which is the core idea of the sickness unto death, is created by the will not to be oneself, the will to be rid of oneself and one's inability to do so. To explain this, Kierkegaard makes a great analogy. When the ambitious man, whose watchword was either Caesar or nothing, does not become Caesar, he is in despair thereat. But this signifies something else, namely, that precisely because he did not become Caesar, he now cannot endure to be himself. So properly, he is not in despair over the fact that he did not become Caesar, but he is in despair over himself for the fact that he had not become Caesar. In other words, one's self cannot help but be that self. So if one has the desire not to be that self, he despairs, for he is unable to destroy his self. But as painful as it may be to be aware of such a state, Soren Kierkegaard tells us that it is necessary to do so, because being unconscious of one's despair is by definition the deepest form of despair. Because one can only contend with his pain if he is conscious of the fact that there is a trauma. Another important idea is that since the self is eternal and, as we will see later, it is also before God's infinitude, if one is not to strive for wholeness with oneself, he is condemned to be in eternal despair. Later on, Kierkegaard makes sure to show the link between free will and the self. For one cannot exist without the other, but one has to exist if the other exists too. And thus, man can only use his will if he is aware of himself being spirit. In plain terms, one needs to have faith in the fact that his consciousness is not an element that is bound to his physical body. Otherwise, he is not free to act in the manner that he chooses to. Never suppress your will to be rid of your spirit, and never suppress your spirit to be rid of your will. When it comes to addressing tragedy and the danger of tragedy, most people think of death as the ultimate example. But Kierkegaard disagrees. He writes, "When death is the greatest danger, one hopes for life. But when one learns to know the even more horrifying danger, one hopes for death." The horrifying danger that he speaks of is the danger of losing oneself, which, according to the book, can pass off in the world as quietly as if it were nothing. For man's ignorance knows no end. The first form of despair that Kierkegaard discusses is that which lies in the synthesis between possibility and necessity. One of the main syntheses of man. Firstly, if one loses oneself in the infinite of possibility, he fails to actualize his potential. Thus he does not become himself, which of course leads him to being in despair. To be clear, actualization, according to Kierkegaard, is the unity of possibility and necessity, or the act of necessitating the potential of action. The opposite kind of despair would be necessity's despair, which is the lack or the denial of possibility. This is when one doesn't realize the extent of his potential, or when the potential is crushed. According to the book, a person who lacks imagination and possibility is a person who is in lack of faith, a person who only sees limitations. Quote, "To lack possibility means either that everything has become necessary or that everything has become trivial." Kierkegaard goes on to describe the essence of one of his most popular ideas, that of the night of faith. I will speak more about this concept in the future, but in the context of The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard states that the night of faith fully understands all limitation, and yet he puts his faith in God's infinitude of possibility and thus never stops striving to actualize the infinitude of his potential. For Kierkegaard, health is the ability to solve contradictions, and faith is the ultimate tool for such a task. And it is his strong belief that one needs both possibility and necessity in order to become his self. Quote, "Possibility is for the self what oxygen is for breathing, but it is no more possible for either possibility or necessity alone to provide the conditions for the breath of prayer than for a person to breathe only oxygen or nitrogen." As an example of a man who lacks possibility, Kierkegaard speaks of the petty bourgeois, saying that the petty bourgeois is spiritless, while the determinist and the fatalist are in a state of spiritual despair. But spiritlessness, too, is despair. He suggests that man's imagination must push him beyond the probable, because when the petty bourgeois is faced with the transcendent, he despairs, for he becomes aware of his lack of faith. This specific point really hit me personally, because this exact situation happened to me when I used to think of myself as a naturalist/atheist. For when my consciousness touched the connection between the transcendent and the physical, I too felt the pain of understanding my arrogance as well as my ignorance. Because as The Sickness Unto Death also mentions, the petty bourgeois thinks he can carry possibility in the cage of probability, thinks of himself as the master, when in reality he has only become a slave of spiritlessness. Kierkegaard then writes, "People prefer living in the basement of the house of existence, meaning that they would rather be in error about the nature of existence, but feel like they are in control, compared to the opposite." But as mentioned before, not knowing that one is in despair simply means being under illusion. For no matter how intense the aesthetic enjoyment is, a self does not become spirit without a religious essence. Quote, "Pagan virtues are splendid vices," said the old fathers of the church. One of the points that are as great as controversial, however, is Kierkegaard's thoughts about suicide. Quote, "Suicide itself is not despair. The fact that the pagan judged suicide as an option is the despair." By that, he is of course talking about those who do not have real faith, and speaks of their lack of faith as the source of agony in one's decision to commit suicide. But faith can only be gained after one is conscious of his despair. This is a hard pill to swallow, because as we said before, the intensity of one's despair increases as his consciousness of it increases as well. However, even while being conscious of one's despair, one may still not see the path of faith, for he may also be drawn towards the path of defiance, otherwise known as resentment. In this case, the man who despairs is conscious of his despair and also partially conscious of himself as something eternal, but then refuses to acknowledge the exact nature of his sickness, either due to weakness or due to, again, defiance. The despair of weakness is that of the earthly, and one step further is the despair of one's consciousness about the fact that he has been despairing over something earthly, which makes him feel humiliated in the presence of the eternal. Or as Kierkegaard himself writes, "As a father who disinherits his son, the self will not acknowledge itself after it has been so weak. But the eternal issue then is that the son cannot cease to be one's son, and the self cannot cease to be one's self." Later on, the book makes an important remark about introverts and extroverts. Introversion comes with the self's realization of being spirit. The introvert needs to spend time with himself in order to sort out his relationship with the transcendent in his spirit, while extroverts see no value in that because they have not yet understood the nature of their self, and thus see no value in solitude. One of the more macabre ideas of the text is that if one who despairs from the shame of not actualizing his spirit while conscious of it continues to be ashamed, he is most likely going to commit suicide, for his weakness will continue to grow. The defiant person, however, goes a step further, and instead of being ashamed, he grows angry towards the nature of being itself. One can very easily see that in many criminals too, like the Columbine killers back in 1999. Or as Kierkegaard beautifully describes it, it is the despair of wanting to be oneself in hatred towards existence. With these last words, we have come to the end of the first part of The Sickness Unto Death, though I'm going to talk about the second part in a future essay. For me personally, Soren Kierkegaard is one of the people that have had the most impact on my beliefs, for he has the very rare ability to grasp abstract ideas that explain much of our universe's truths and put them into paper in a concise and meaningful way. And although he speaks to us about the most terrible situations of the human condition, he also motivates us to take action, to stop being passive when confronting our despair, because we are, at the end of the day, responsible. It is in our hands to actualize our potential and to become our true selves.